ton of very passionately held political views, and I have never once in my life entertained the idea that there should be some government body or some group of elevated experts who have the power to silence the people who disagree with my passionately held views. It would never occur to me to be so impressed with my own wisdom that I would think that people should be banned with the force of law.
The people that are demanding censorship are not imagining that they themselves will be the ones that are censored.
Michael Shellenberger is an independent journalist who is the founder of the news site Public, a great news site which now resides on Substack. He has been one of the leading journalists from the very start in reporting on the Twitter files, and we've covered the Twitter files at length. We've had Michael on before to talk about some of his reporting. He's the best-selling author of the 2021 book San Francisco, Why Progressives Ruin Cities, and has become a leading advocate of free speech and basic press freedom rights. With his reporting yesterday, he released what he called the Brazil Twitter files, the documents from the Twitter files that pertain to the way in which Brazil has been not only pressuring big tech companies, but imposing censorship on them to the point that this platform, Rumble, is no longer available in Brazil because of the avalanche of censorship orders it has been getting. Obviously, this has been widely debated in Brazil. We've reported on it many times, but these new documents shed a lot of light on just how extreme and out of control this censorship regime is, and we are delighted to welcome Michael Shellenberger to our show once again to talk to him. Michael, it's great to see you. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Great to be with you, Glenn.
All right, so let's start, first of all, before we get to some of the substantive revelations, with the question of why did you choose to report on Brazil, and why should Americans care about what's happening in Brazil?
Well, first I should say I feel a little bad that it took us this long. You may remember that the first Twitter files came out in December 2022, about a month after Elon Musk took over the company. We've had these files for a long time. There's just been a lot of material to go through. And as you know, you've done such good reporting on it. There's a worldwide crackdown right now on free speech in so many countries: Ireland, Scotland, the European Union, Britain, Canada, the United States. So I feel a little guilty about this. Brazil's a country I care a lot about. I lived here 30 years ago. I was invited back this week. I'm actually in Brazil right now at a conference on freedom issues, on free speech issues, of course. So I felt this obligation to look through the files again and look a little harder, honestly. And what we discovered really shocked us. It's really a growing demand for censorship, both from the Sao Paulo, one of the biggest city in Brazil's prosecutor's office, from members of Congress, and then finally from this very powerful Supreme Court judge who you've covered in the past, of course. His name is Alexandre de Moraes, and he is this it's shocking, his power. But basically, just to cut to the big punchline, they were demanding things that we had not seen anybody ever demand of Twitter before, so extreme that even the Twitter staff, which was going along with a lot of censorship demands, was pushing back. One of them, just to give an example of it, they wanted to read the private direct messages of people who had simply retweeted particular hashtags. They wanted to read their private messages. They also, this is the Supreme Court justice, but also the Sao Paulo prosecutor's office. They wanted to read the private personal information from people who had anonymous accounts. These are such kind of radical violations of privacy that Twitter pushed back. And then in response, the government sought to criminally prosecute the top attorney in Brazil for Twitter. So, it was just kind of one shocking thing after another, building from early 2020 to 2022. It covers that period, and that's the first set of Twitter files Brazil that you're highlighting on the screen.
You mentioned one of the documents where even the Twitter officials, obviously accustomed to complying with censorship orders, were kind of shocked, and they said, quote, "We are going to push back." And you said Brazil's High Electoral Court, which Alexandre de Moraes controls, that's the Supreme Court justice who has been in charge of the censorship regime for the start, also demanded that Twitter reveal the identities of users. On October 25th, 2021, Twitter senior legal counsel Rafael Batista emailed his colleagues to let them know that the court was, quote, "compelling us to track down and unmask users who use specific hashtags." The TSE's request was illegal, noted Baptista, and so Twitter would resist the court's order. He said that Twitter was, quote, going to push back because there was, quote, no evidence of illegality in the use of the hashtags, and because the TSE was demanding, quote, mass and indiscriminate disclosure of private user data, which characterizes a violation of privacy and other constitutional rights.
You know, and as you said, look, I mean, very few people have been a bigger critic of Twitter than Twitter pre-Elon Musk than me. They went along with a lot of censorious demands. The case in the United States was what they were really outsourcing. The U.S. government was outsourcing censorship to Stanford Internet Observatory and other groups. But here in Brazil, it was coming right from the Supreme Court justice. Of course, the context here is that they have disallowed the former President Bolsonaro from running for president again for another 8 years. Whatever you think of the guy, if you can't vote for the candidate of your choice, that's an undermine of democracy. Well, here you see. And I mean, I've been here now for just a couple of days, Glenn, and I talk to journalists, and they're scared of what they say. It's had a direct impact. It's had a chilling effect on them.
Yeah, you and I had a chance to chat briefly about your coming on the show, and I mentioned to you that I've done a lot of reporting in my career that had a lot of risk to it, including reporting we did in Brazil and the Snowden reporting and my work with WikiLeaks. And a lot of those risks, resulted in attempts to prosecute or investigate. But I've never had any time in my life when I was genuinely worried about what the consequences might be of criticizing any public official until I decided that I was going to use my platform to speak out vocally and continuously and strongly against the Supreme Court Judge Alexandre de Moraes, because there are people who have done that, who have gone to prison. There are people in exile in Brazil who, if they come back to Brazil from the United States, will be put into jail immediately. This is a judge who has seized a kind of power I've never really seen before in the hands of a single political official. And a lot of people talk about their countries being tyrannical. But ultimately, the real test is, do you have a well-founded fear of what might happen if you actually speak out against somebody?
I'm so struck by often the pettiness of the demands, and this Supreme Court Justice Jim Moraes is very petty. So often they're going after people that have said mean things about them online. It's kind of, but also we saw members of Congress demanding censorship of people. There's like a kind of a thin-skinnedness, a kind that suggests a kind of narcissism, which of course is very common among politicians. But then to see it weaponized in this way. In the United States, the politicians know that there's this thing called the First Amendment, which prevents them from persecuting their political opponents or shutting them down. Obviously, in Brazil, they don't have that strong First Amendment protection. So I would just say, yeah, I mean, it's, we're very bothered by the censorship laundering through the censorship industrial complex in the United States. That's what was so scary. They were engaged in mass censorship involving these supposedly non-governmental organizations, but have been funded by the U.S. government to provide lists of posts that they wanted censored. They were targeting whole narratives. Here in Brazil, though, like you were saying, I mean, we're talking about prison. I mean, you're talking about putting people in jail for the things that they say, or massive fines that lead up to a stint in jail. So the chilling effect on speech is the thing that I'm coming away from my visit here most struck by, is that even people that are very strong and that are big believers in free speech and really are people that you would normally count on to speak what they want to say, they're watching what they say. They're careful what they put online, and understandably so. And so I think to see this descend in this way to this kind of totalitarianism, I think it should be a wake-up call to everybody in Western countries that has seen some amount of censorship. But we should look at Brazil and go, this is a country that's been a democratic country since the mid-1990s. It's obviously had a dictatorship for 30 years before that. To see it happening here is just really sad and discouraging. And it makes me angry, and I hope it angers other people enough that they demand that the Brazilian Senate in particular stand up to this thuggish Supreme Court justice who's really trampling on their rights.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things it shows is that you can still have a country that still holds elections and yet still find ways to radically abridge rights. Michael, one of the things that strikes me about the similarity between Brazil and the United States is that so much of this is justified, including by major media outlets, based on the argument that's very similar to the one that justifies much of this in the United States about Trump, but it's about Bolsonaro, namely that Bolsonaro is this unprecedented menace, that he is an anti-democratic fascist, that he wants to overthrow Brazilian democracy, even though he was president for 4 years, lost an election and left. There was an event similar to January 6th on January 8th when a protest against the election and the integrity of it turned into kind of not even as violent as what happened on January 6th, but they invaded government buildings and broke things, and it got the kind of thing you don't want to see. But they turned that into, oh, we face a coup, we face a threat to democracy, and so we can't even allow free speech anymore. And as I said, the media has been leading the way, as they do in the United States, in justifying a lot of this through that narrative. You've been in Brazil now since you did this groundbreaking reporting, and it was just 24 hours. But when I've seen you on Brazilian media and being interviewed by Brazilian media, it's typically been right-wing media. I'm wondering whether you've gotten a lot of coverage about your reporting or requests to interview you from sort of the big Globo type mainstream and corporate media.
Well, I am happy to report that I just heard from Globo, and they are going to do an interview with me tomorrow. I also had a chance to speak with about 30 journalists, mostly young, around 30 years old. They kept asking me, what are you proposing? What do you think should be done about all the misinformation? The right response to misinformation and hate speech is free speech. It's accurate speech. It's loving speech. It's speech that pushes back. I think there's something really wrong with us, or wrong with people that hear things they disagree with or they consider misinformation, and their response is to want censorship. I mean, I disagree with almost everything I hear all the time. I mean, I mostly disagree with what I see on social media or on the news. I agree with a smaller part of it. And yet I would never imagine that the right response is to have a secret committee of journalists or government officials whose job it is to decide what the truth is in advance and shut down those alternative voices. A big part of getting stories right and getting issues right and even changing our own minds is being able to have that free expression. So once again, Glenn, I find myself in this really strange position that I've been in many times over the year and 5 months since the Twitter files first broke, which is actually having to make the basic case for free speech, including to professionals whose jobs depend on free speech. Some of that may just be economics, that these are journalists who feel threatened by the rise of social media and the decline of traditional media. But I just think another part of it is cultural, where these are folks that have grown up in sheltered environments and they have a really naive view of the truth of the world. I try to always ask people, can you give me an example of a time where you said something that you think the government should have censored? And the short answer is basically no one has an answer to that question. The people that are demanding censorship are not imagining that they themselves will be the ones that are censored. So I do think it's those sorts of interventions that are required. And it's the same, like you were saying, I mean, that part, the cultural response from journalists in the United States and in Brazil and in Europe, it's basically the same. They just keep going, we can't allow all this misinformation. And the answer to that is, of course you can, and you can respond with the truth and the accurate information as you see fit.
Yeah, there's such a hubris required, I think, to believe, like you said, I mean, I have a ton of very passionately held political views, and I have never once in my life entertained the idea that there should be some government body or some group of elevated experts who have the power to silence the people who disagree with my passionately held views. It would never occur to me to be so impressed with my own wisdom that I would think that people should be banned with the force of law from disagreeing with me. And yet, and I think you probably have seen this in Brazil, even more so than the United States, because there's no First Amendment, because the idea of absolute free speech is considered almost this kind of exotic or extremist or even fascist doctrine. It's just so ironic because every fascist regime doesn't implement absolute free speech. They implement censorship that looks a lot like the regime that you just reported on, but they nonetheless believe free speech is this kind of absolutist thing. And the one question I always have for them is, look, maybe it would be great to live in a world where all false statements were banned and all hate speech was eliminated. But the question always is, who do you trust to decide that?
It should be raising alarms and red flags all around the world from people that cherish their freedom and haven't really seen it tested like this, in 75 years, I would say. So I do hope the Twitter Files Brazil becomes another moment for, freedom-loving people on left and right to remind ourselves of the importance of free speech.